Welcome. This session of the World's 100 Greatest Books features one of the earliest novels in our series. In fact, it may even be the first novel in English history. The book is The Pilgrim's Progress, written in the late 1600s by the author and preacher John Bunyan, an English religious reformer. It is the only novel in our series that's an allegory, a story like a fable in which a moral principle is presented by means of fictional characters and events. Allegories are more common in poems, epic poems, short stories, and spiritual works and scriptures like the Bible. The Pilgrim's Progress is a spiritual work. The pilgrim in the title is a spiritual seeker, and his progress is the path towards redemption or enlightenment. But it's also a novel. It has a continuing plot and continuing characters. Those characters have allegorical names like Christian, Faithful, the Worldly Wise Man, Hopeful, Giant Despair, and Evangelist. The places have names like the City of Destruction, Wall of Salvation, Hill of Difficulty, Enchanted Ground, and Celestial City. The plot itself, although an enchanting myth, is also the ultimate plot of the human destiny. Pilgrim's Progress is unlike any other work of its time. It's not the work one would expect of a Puritan preacher, of an uneducated man, of a man from the working class, of a man of 17th century England. Yet John Bunyan was all those things. In his greatest book, Bunyan somehow freed himself completely from dogma and from the restrictions of his class and background. For many years, scholars have wondered how this poorly educated son of a country tinker, a zealous preacher, and a formerly preachy writer could overcome such barriers of class, culture, and dogma. But the author himself supplied the answer, for he was as surprised as anyone by the book that finally developed. His original intention was to write a treatise, a formal and systematic account of the Christian life. But as he wrote, he experienced a rapid multiplication of ideas, which came upon him, in his words, like sparks from the coals of fire do fly. These ideas forced him to put the treatise aside and to give free rein to his imagination. When he saw the result, this first allegorical novel, he wrote an apology to his readers for giving in to his inspiration, fearing they might fail to recognize the serious piece of theology hidden therein. Yet he also realized the strengths of an allegory or simile in conveying a message, and said, "A similitude is warrantable, for both Christ and the apostles did sometimes use them to the end that souls might be better informed." Still, his own misgivings about the book caused him to delay publishing it for several years. The final result, of course, is a work that enjoyed more popularity in 17th century literature than any other except the King James Bible. And no other work from a writer of his social class in any period, no other Puritan or even committed Christian work, has had such fame. Because he allowed himself to be lifted above the constraints of theology, he created a work that is also lifted above the entire body of other 17th century literature. Bunyan used nothing of the literary culture of his time. He hadn't studied the works of authors like John Donne that all serious writers of the period studied, and if he had, he would have found no predecessor and no contemporary to take his style from. But this was a disadvantage that he turned to his advantage. He was free to discover his own genius. It was also the way he would have preferred, since he had considerably less respect for learning than he did for experience and illumination. He made no secret of his lack of education, and said, "I have not borrowed my doctrine from libraries. I depend upon the sayings of no man. I found it in the scriptures of truth, among the true sayings of God." To understand his view, it's necessary to know a little about 17th century Puritanism. Puritanism was a social movement, and most of its literature focused on the actual experiences of men rather than religious theory. Puritans believed that salvation was won by playing a full part in the world, not by cloistering oneself in a monastery or meditating in a cave. So Puritans were, above all else, practical, concerned with the problems of daily living. The scholarly approach to life, or scholasticism as it's called, was rejected just as the life in a monastery was. This doesn't mean that Puritans considered inner personal experiences to hold no value. Rather, internal experiences were given equal weight to responses in the external world. Everyday behavior, in social, professional, and domestic realms, reflected internal faith and knowing. Here is where faith was experienced, tested, experimented with, and validated. When he creatively represented these real experiences in The Pilgrim's Progress, it startled people. But this realism is another reason the book is considered to be so unique. It's an imaginative and very persuasive allegory, but at the same time it's authentic. Everything in it is visualized in terms of the contemporary life Bunyan knew. The journey itself proceeds along a muddy, poorly signposted 17th century road, over hills, through dark valleys, and across bleak moors. The travelers must endure terrible weather and the risk of floods. They see the skeletons of criminals hanging from a roadside gallows, are wary of highwaymen, fearful of night, and grateful for the refuge of an inn. The various incidents on the journey are often mundane and common. A traveler gives wrong directions. A dog barks when someone knocks on a door. Boys munch on apples. This sense of realism is also carried into the conversations and dialogue. They are the ordinary conversations of men and women of the times. They talk about their spouses, family and background, and how they make a living. They exchange information about the road ahead and anecdotes about their travels. They even gossip about their neighbors sometimes. Yet beneath all this casual chatter, the characters are busy assessing each other, trying to determine whether or not they'd make good traveling companions. Christian, the central character, is forever challenged to tell his friends from his foes. Penetrating all these mundane conversations and events is Bunyan's genius for observation. He has a sharp eye for the mannerisms, appearances, and behavior of ordinary people. He gives the character ignorance briskness. He gives atheist a very great laughter. His characters begin to represent moral states, particular qualities and attributes. Often the characters behave in a way that results from this characteristic rather than like the characteristic itself. In other words, the character pliable is very guilty and embarrassed. Guilt doesn't mean the same thing as pliable, but a man who is pliable often feels guilty for what he is and what he does. Bunyan's characters all speak with the actual language spoken in the towns and on the roads of the English countryside in the 1600s. Being uneducated and having no model of rustic language from books, he simply duplicated what he heard. He made no pretense to sound literate. He used the same plain style that Puritan preachers used to address their rural congregations. This was a moral and practical choice. To the Puritans, fine speaking was associated with hypocrisy and with an elevated social status. It was used by preachers who had no sincere desire to reach the common people and who muddled the simplicity of the gospel with elaborate language and allusions to writers and works the people had no understanding for. It was the goal of the Puritans to serve the common man. Bunyan himself, as you'll see in a few minutes when we tell you of his life, was often in battle against the churches of England and of Rome. This wasn't because of some dispute over doctrine, but because of a pastoral concern, because he sought to make spirituality accessible to the simple folk and relevant to their daily lives. So he took the plain, direct style of his preaching and of the people themselves and gave it to his book. As a result, it has an authentic colloquial tone. It's full of idiomatic phrases and provincial expressions not found in other works of the period. The characters walk a good stitch. They set out to go a-fooling. And they have that kind of country common sense that makes them say things like, "While we are out of danger, we are out, but when we are in, we are in." Bunyan knew that his use of this native language opened him to disdain and was not the fashion in literary circles, but he refused to change it. For over a century after his death, he was looked down on for this reason. Pilgrim's Progress was considered unrefined, unsuitable for people of quality, lacking in sensitivity. Not until the Romantic age was his style truly appreciated. Then writers like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and others saw in it a purity and truth that was to be admired. What makes the book so interesting is that along with this authentic dialogue, there is poetry, and along with the straightforward common events, there is mystery. This combination of fantasy and realism made it an especially original work and gained its author a unique place in literary history. John Bunyan created a realistic allegory with none of the contradictions that name might imply. And in doing so, he wrote a book that is a bridge between two worlds, the medieval world with its love of allegory, myth, and legend, and the modern world with its insistence on realism and authenticity. John Bunyan was born around November 30th, 1628, at Elstow, near the country town of Bedford, England. He was the eldest of 3 children of a tinker named Thomas Bunyan and his wife Margaret Bentley. He described himself and his family as, in his words, of a low and inconsiderable generation, my father's house being of that rank that is meanest and most despised of all the families in the land. Notwithstanding the meanness and inconsiderableness of my parents, it pleased God to put it into their hearts to put me to school. Young Bunyan attended a local grammar school, but only for a short time, and thereafter he followed in his father's trade. The year 1644, when he was 16 years old, was a significant one. His mother died, and a month later his sister also died. His father promptly remarried. These upsets may have brought on the wildness of his youth, which he wrote of later. In November, Bunyan was called into the parliamentarian army of Cromwell and stationed at the garrison at Newport Pagnell. It's unlikely he saw any military action at Newport Pagnell, but he did have the opportunity to hear the new radical Puritan preachers. 2 years later, his company was disbanded, and he returned to his hometown of Elstow. When he was about 20, Bunyan married his first wife, whose name is unknown, but of whom Bunyan said, "Her father was counted godly." The couple had 4 children, the eldest of whom, a daughter, was blind. Under the influence of his wife, he joined the Nonconformists. During the 1650s, he underwent a prolonged spiritual crisis, which he later wrote about in one of the classics of Puritan spirituality, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, which was published in 1666. Following his conversion, he joined the Bedford Baptist Church and moved to that town. It was then that he began, in his words, "in private and with much weakness and infirmity, to discover my gift." The congregation, too, recognized this gift. It was a gift for preaching. When the pastor of the church died, Bunyan replaced him. He drew great crowds and was in constant demand throughout all the Midland counties. This led to the beginning of his literary career, in which he would publish almost 60 works on divinity, many of them controversial. His first work came out of a dispute with the Quakers, and was called Some Gospel Truths Opened. His books were marked by an uncompromising zeal, a practical, direct style, and a particular concern for the spiritual welfare of common people. In 1658, Bunyan's wife died, and the following year he married his second wife, Elizabeth, with whom he fathered 3 more children. Following the Restoration, Bunyan persisted in his unconventional preaching, in spite of an edict that all divine services should meet the criteria of the established Church of England. In 1660, he was arrested for holding an illegal religious meeting. The Bedford Church became a separatist or nonconformist congregation, meeting in secret. A few months later, he was sentenced to 3 months in the Bedford County Jail. But because he continually refused to promise to give up preaching, his term was ultimately prolonged to 12 years. Petitions by his wife failed to win his release. He was allowed a large degree of freedom in prison and even preached to the inmates. He supported his family by making shoelaces, but was also allowed to pursue his writing, which became the only way he could fill his idle hours. During these prison years, he published Holy City, his spiritual autobiography, Grace Abounding, and began work on Pilgrim's Progress. His first works were not very different from other Puritan divinity works of the time, and were often expository, or tended to explain rather than demonstrate. But they also displayed his aptitude for strong analogies, similes, and metaphors, which became so apparent in the Allegory, Pilgrim's Progress. These first works also reflected his distinct, forceful style and his scorn for hypocrisy, particularly in the rich and lordly. Bunyan was released from prison in 1672 and returned to preaching at the Bedford Church under new license from King Charles II, who had made a declaration of indulgence which allowed greater religious freedom. He began to preach farther and wider, covering 3 English counties. His zeal and spiritual authority earned him the nickname Bishop Bunyan. In the mid-1670s, Bunyan began to seek the advice of his friends on whether he should publish the Pilgrim's Progress. In 1677, he was imprisoned again, this time for only 6 months. The following year, 1678, he finally released Pilgrim's Progress, and for the first time people began to recognize his literary genius. The full title page of the book read, "The Pilgrim's Progress from this world to that which is to come, delivered under the similitude of a dream wherein is discovered the manner of his setting out, his dangerous journey, and safe arrival at the desired country." The Pilgrim's Progress was followed in 1680 by its sequel, The Life and Death of Mr. Badman, and by a very elaborate allegory entitled The Holy War, which was published 2 years later. Bunyan released a Part 2 of the Pilgrim's Progress in 1684. To many historians, these works back up Bunyan's own claim that he was the founder of the English novel. In 1685, he made a gift of all his property to his wife as protection for his family in case of further imprisonment, for now England had entered the period known as the Tory Revenge, in which there was renewed persecution of nonconformists. His fame as a preacher continued to increase until his death, by which time only 10 editions of the Pilgrim's Progress had been sold. In 1688, while riding on horseback to London in a heavy rain, Bunyan contracted a fever. He died at the home of a London friend on August 31st, at the age of 60. Here now is the story of the book which assured his immortality, The Pilgrim's Progress. It begins with the lines, "As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where was a den, and I laid me down in that place to sleep. And as I slept, I dreamed a dream. I dreamed, and behold, I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place, with his face from his own home, a book in his hand, and a great burden upon his back. I looked, and saw him open the book and read therein. And as he read, he wept and trembled, and not being able longer to contain, he broke out with a lamentable cry, saying, 'What shall I do?' Now the story continues, as the narrator follows the man with the book who has uttered this lamentable cry. He dwelt in the city of destruction, and being persuaded that the place was about to be destroyed by fire, and not able to convince his wife and children to go away with him, he resolved to leave this world alone. He set out, but found himself walking in the fields, looking this way and that, unsure of which way to go. He met with a man named Evangelist, and this man gave him a scroll which read, 'Fly from the wrath to come.' The man asked where he should fly to, and Evangelist directed him across a very wide field, towards a shining light that would lead him to Wicket Gate. There he should knock upon the gate, and he would receive further instructions. So I saw in my dream that this man began to run. His wife and children began to cry after him, but he put his fingers in his ears and ran on, crying, 'Life, life, eternal life.' 2 of his neighbors, obstinate and pliable, resolved to fetch him back by force. But Christian, for that was the man's name, invited them to join him. Obstinate refused, but Pliable agreed. On the way to Wicket Gate, Christian told Pliable of the glories of the far country to which he was bound. They drew near to the Slough of Despond, and began to sink in the mire. Pliable struggled out on the side nearest to his own house, and so he returned home, leaving Christian to tumble in the slough alone. He managed to struggle his way to the opposite side of the pit, which was nearest Wicket Gate, but he couldn't rise from the slough because of his burden. He was plucked out by a man named Help, and proceeded on his way, only to encounter Mr. Worldly Wise Man, who dwelt in the town of Carnal Policy. This fellow suggested an easier way for the pilgrim to be rid of his burden than passing through the Wicket Gate. He directed him instead to the village of Morality, to the home of Legality, who, with his son Civility, could show him how to be rid of his burden. Christian was about to take this advice, but then he saw the mountain that rose next to the house of Legality, and he feared it would topple onto his head. At that moment Evangelist appeared again and rebuked Christian for going astray. Christian began to cry out lamentably, and repented that he had followed the advice of Mr. Worldly Wise Man. Evangelist warned him not to turn aside again, and then bid him Godspeed. So now I saw that he arrived at the Wicket Gate, and when he knocked, Goodwill opened to him. Goodwill advised him about the straight and narrow path he must follow, and added that furthermore he must be content to bear his burden until he came to the place of deliverance, where it would fall off by itself. Then Christian began to gird up his loins and to address himself to his journey. Goodwill told him that when he was some distance from the gate, he would come to the house of the interpreter, and he should knock, for interpreter would tell him excellent things. He arrived at that house, and interpreter invited him in, saying he would show him that which would be profitable to him. He showed him a room full of dust that was the heart of man, a room with 2 children named Passion and Patience, and Passion was much discontented because she could not wait for things, and a room where a man kept throwing water on a flame that only got higher and hotter. The fire was the work of grace, and the man was the devil. The interpreter showed him many things, and when he was done, Christian went on his way, saying, "Here I have seen things rare and profitable, things pleasant, dreadful, things to make me stable in what I have begun to take in hand. Then let me think on them, and understand wherefore they showed me was, and let me be thankful, O good interpreter, to thee." Now Christian was on his way to the celestial city, but he approached a highway which was fenced on either side with a wall, the wall of salvation. He ran until he came to a place, somewhat ascending, that had a cross on it, and a little below in the bottom a sepulchre. So I saw in my dream that just as Christian came up with the cross, his burden loosened from off his shoulders, and fell from off his back, and began to tumble, and so continued to do till it came to the mouth of the sepulchre, where it fell in, and I saw it no more. Now behold, 3 shining ones met him and saluted him with, "Peace be to thee." His rags were removed, and he was given a change of clothes. A mark was set upon his forehead, and he received a roll with a seal on it to give at the celestial gate. Now I saw that Christian proceeded on his way with joy and singing. He came across 3 sleepers, simple, sloth, and presumption, and each was fettered at their heels. He tried to warn them of their peril, but they would not listen. Then formalist and hypocrisy came tumbling over the wall, and with them he tried to reason, but they wouldn't listen either, and soon the 2 friends went off to try a shortcut. Instead of climbing the hill difficulty, which loomed ahead, one followed the way of danger, and the other the way of disaster. They thought these ways would lead, just as the narrow straight path did, up the hill to their destination. But the paths did not lead the same way, and soon the men were seen no more. About midway to the top of the hill of difficulty was a pleasant arbor established so travelers could refresh themselves along the way. Christian stopped and renewed himself with some sleep, then proceeded towards the top of the hill, not realizing he had dropped his roll with the seal in the arbor. He went on, and at the top he met 2 new fellows, timorous and mistrust. They warned him of lions along the way. But Christian resolved boldly to continue on his way, lions or no. At this point he realized he was missing the roll with the seal, the roll that was the assurance of his life and his entry into the gates of the celestial city. He returned to the arbor and found it, but then he saw, just by the highway, the palace beautiful. Now it was night time, so he hurried along to reach the palace. But there before him were 2 lions. The lions were chained, but he saw not the chains, and so, overcome with fear, he stopped. There was a porter at a nearby lodge, and he called to Christian that the lions were chained, and that he should proceed along the path, keeping in the middle. Then the porter summoned a beautiful damsel, Discretion, and bid her speak to the traveler, who desired entertainment for the night in that house built for the relief and security of pilgrims. Discretion summoned Prudence, Piety, and Charity, who discoursed with him until supper time. They talked about his travels and why he had left home. Christian rested that night in a bedchamber called Peace, and the next day he awoke and sang, "Where am I now? Is this the love and care of Jesus for the men that pilgrims are? Thus to provide, that I should be forgiven, and dwell already the next door to heaven." They told him he shouldn't depart until they had shown him the rarities and records of the place. They showed him records of the worthy acts of the servants of their Lord, how these servants had subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and out of weakness were made strong. They showed him prophecies and predictions of things that have their certain accomplishment, both to the dread of enemies and the comfort of pilgrims. They showed him some of the tools of these servants, Moses' rod, the jawbone with which Samson did mighty feats, the sling and stone with which David slew Goliath. They asked him to stay 1 more night, and he did, for they promised if the next day was clear, they would show him the delectable heavens, which were closer to his desired haven than the place where he presently was. The morning did dawn clear, and to the south the delectable mountains rose in Emmanuel's land. Before continuing on his journey, Christian was supplied with armor from the palace armory. Then Discretion, Piety, Charity, and Prudence followed him to the foot of the hill and gave him a loaf of bread and a cluster of raisins when they left him. Christian then proceeded through the Valley of Humiliation, and soon caught sight of a fiend named Apollon, a Greek term for the destroyer, who is Satan. Apollon came towards him, and I saw in my dream that there ensued a terrific combat between these two, which lasted more than half a day, until Christian was spent and began to despair for his life. But in the end he gave Apollon a deadly thrust with his sword, and thereupon the fiend spread forth his dragon wings and sped away. Christian gave thanks to the Lord for his deliverance, and there came to him a hand which carried some leaves from the tree of life, which healed his wounds. After taking refreshment, he continued on his way and came upon another valley, the Valley of the Shadow of Death, a very solitary place. There he met 2 men who were turning back, and they warned him of the coming dangers. The pathway through the valley was exceedingly narrow. On one side of it was a deep ditch, on the other side a quagmire. In the middle of the valley was the mouth of hell, out of which flame and smoke arose in abundance. The sword of Christian was useless in this predicament, and so he had to rely on the weapon, all prayer. Now Christian heard sorrowful voices and rushings to and fro. He saw a company of the fiends coming to meet him, but when he declared, "I will walk in the strength of the Lord God," they pulled back. The second part of the valley was even more dangerous than the first, and full of pitfalls. At the end of the valley was the cave of the giants, whose names were Pagan and Pope. Christian passed them without much danger, although he saw the bones and bodies of former pilgrims strewn about. And I saw that Christian now overtook another pilgrim to the celestial city, whose name was Faithful. Faithful had been his neighbor in the city of destruction, and Christian was not surprised to see him, for the porter at the Palace Beautiful had told him of this man's journey. The two went on together, talking of the adventures Faithful had had so far on his pilgrimage. Christian and Faithful soon discovered another companion along the way, Talkative, the son of Saywell, a man with a beguiling tongue. They were finally rid of him, and as they passed through the wilderness, Evangelist came up to them, praised their victories, and urged them to go on. He predicted there were many tribulations ahead for them in the town of Vanity, which they were now about to enter. He also said that one of them would have to die there. And I now saw Christian and Faithful approach the town of Vanity and enter into a fair that was held there. Now in this town of Vanity a great fair is held the year long, and at this fair is displayed merchandise to tempt and sell to the pilgrims. The fair was instituted 5,000 years ago, and anyone who wanted to reach the celestial city had to pass through this town. When Christian and Faithful arrived, a great hubbub rose around them because of their clothing and speech, which were different from any of them that traded at the fair, and also because they would not even look upon the tempting wares offered to them. When mockingly asked, "What will ye buy?" they answered, "We buy the truth." Finally, the great one of the fair ordered that they be brought forward to be examined. They were questioned, and then beaten and besmeared with dirt. Then they were put into a cage to become a spectacle for all the men at the fair. When some of the spectators tried to defend them, the two pilgrims were beaten once again and put in irons. They were led up and down before the fair, and then their feet were fastened in the stocks. Later they were brought before a trial, but the men had already secretly resolved to condemn them to death. The judge was Lord Hategood, and the charge was that the pilgrims had made commotions and diversions in the town, and that they were enemies to and disturbers of trade at the fair. 3 witnesses appeared against them: Envy, Superstition, and Pickthank. Faithful was called up first, and he boldly defended himself, but he was condemned to death by the jury, the most cruel death they could invent. They whipped him, beat him, lanced his flesh with knives, stoned him, pricked him with their swords, and last of all they burned him to ashes at the stake. And after his tormentors were through with him, I saw that a chariot and a couple of horses took Faithful into the clouds with the sound of a trumpet, and to the quickest way to the celestial city. But Christian was sent back to prison and remained there some time. Finally he managed to escape, and a new companion joined him in his journey, Hopeful. They quickly fled from the town and overtook another traveler in front of them, whose name was Byends, from the town of Fair Speech. Now Byends and his companions that joined them differed from other travelers in 2 ways. They never strove against wind and tide, and they were most jealous when the fellow Religion traveled in silver slippers. Byends' companions were Hold the World, Mr. Moneylove, and Mr. Save-All. They had all been schoolfellows together, taught by one Mr. Gripeman, in the county of Coveting in the north. This schoolmaster taught them the art of getting, either by violence, flattery, or by putting on the guise of religion, and these 4 gentlemen had attained much of the art of their master, so that they could each of them have kept such a school themselves. They posed Christian a deceitful question, but he shamed them with his answer. The question was, suppose a man, a minister, or a tradesman, should have an advantage lie before him to get the good blessings of this life. Yet he can by no means attain them unless in appearance he becomes extraordinarily zealous in some points of religion that he meddled not with before. May he not use this means to attain his end, and yet be a right honest man? And Christian had answered, If it be unlawful to follow Christ for loaves, how much more abominable is it to make of him and religion a stalking horse to get and enjoy the world? Nor do we find any other than heathens, hypocrites, devils, and witches that are of this opinion. After his response, the others fell behind him, and Christian and Hopeful proceeded on ahead. They crossed the narrow plain Ease, and on the other side of it found a little hill called Lucre, and in that hill a silver mine, over which stood the fellow Demas, who would tempt passers-by to come and dig. Christian and Hopeful refused, but when Byends and his companions came by, they went over to Demas at first bidding, and were never seen again, having either smothered or fallen into the pit. The pilgrims now passed an old monument by the road, which was Lot's wife, turned into a pillar of salt, placed there as a warning for them. Then they came to a pleasant river, the river of God, or the river of the water of life. Their path ran along the bank, and they walked there with great delight, and refreshed themselves with the water of the river and the fruit of the trees. Then they lay down and slept in a meadow beyond the river. And I beheld in my dream that their path then left the river, and the road became rough to their feet, so that they wished for a better road. Now they saw on the left side of the road a meadow called Bypath Meadow, and a stile or series of steps leading into it. They followed the stile to a path, and the path to a fence, which seemed to lead in their direction, although Hopeful was afraid of it from the very first. Along came Vain Confidence, who assured them it led to the holy city. But the night grew dark, and hearing a moaning ahead of them, they found that Vain Confidence had fallen into a deep pit. Rain, thunder, and lightning came, and the water began to rise. But Christian struggled back over the path from whence they'd come, coming close to drowning at least 9 or 10 times. They couldn't reach the stile that night and fell asleep. The next morning came Giant Despair, owner of Doubting Castle, on whose grounds they were. He took them prisoners and threw them into a nasty and stinking dungeon. The wife of Giant Despair was Diffidence, and her advice the travelers were soundly beaten. The next day the giant was angry they were still alive, and urged them to make an end of themselves. Christian had some desire to follow this advice, as their lot was miserable, but Hopeful persuaded him that they shouldn't be their own murderers. The giant would then have made an end to them himself, but he fell into one of his fits. He took them to the castle yard and showed them the bones and skeletons of former pilgrims he had killed, and threatened them with the same. That night, after much prayer, Christian found in his shirt a key called Promise, which would open any lock in Doubting Castle. So the two happily escaped and came again to the highway. They made their way to the stile, and there they erected a pillar with a writing to warn those who should come after of the giant and his treatment of pilgrims. Then they continued until they came to the Delectable Mountains. On the summit they found shepherds feeding their flocks. Their names were Knowledge, Experience, Watchful, and Sincere. The shepherds entertained the travelers in their tents, and next day showed them Mount Error and Mount Caution, and a byway to hell. Christian and Hopeful proceeded on their way, after having glimpsed the gates of the celestial city through the perspective glass at the top of a hill called Clear. One of the shepherds gave them a note of the way, another bid them beware of the flatterer, and a third admonished them to take heed that they sleep not on the enchanted ground. The fourth simply bid them Godspeed. And I dreamed again, and I saw that Ignorance came out of the country of Conceit to join the travelers, and he approached them from a crooked lane. They pressed on ahead of Ignorance, but at a crossroads they ran into Flatterer. He was a man black of flesh, but covered with a very light robe. They fell into a net, and then they remembered the advice of the shepherd to beware of this Flatterer. A shining one with a whip of small cord in his hand led them back to the right path, asking them why they hadn't read their note of direction, and chastising them for not following instructions. Now Christian and Hopeful were met by Atheist, who mocked them, but they walked by him and continued on their way. Soon they approached a certain country whose air tended to make them drowsy, and Hopeful became dull and heavy with sleep. Christian reminded him of the warning from the shepherd not to sleep on the enchanted ground, and he tried to revive Hopeful by involving him in lively conversation. Hopeful talked about how he had been set upon the path to the holy city, and when he finished his story, Ignorance approached again, but he couldn't keep pace with the pilgrims, and fell behind once more. The pilgrims passed through the enchanted ground and entered into the country of Beulah upon the borders of heaven. The air was sweet and pleasant, and there were vineyards and gardens that had been planted just for the refreshment of travelers. The two tarried a while and slept. Then they arose and headed towards the city, and on their way they met 2 men in clothing of gold, like the city itself, and were told of 2 more difficulties that lay ahead. Soon they came to the river of death, over which there was no bridge. The river was very deep, but they entered it anyway, and Christian feared he would surely die. Hopeful labored to keep Christian's head above water. At length they emerged from the river and found the 2 shining ones waiting for them on the other side. The 2 pilgrims had lost their clothing in the river, and now, with much agility, they hastened up the hill, on the top of which the city stood. The shining ones led them, talking about the glories of the heavenly Jerusalem. As they neared the gates, a company of heavenly hosts came out to meet them, with several of the king's trumpeters, so it seemed as if heaven itself had come down to greet them. And thus they came to the gate. And I saw in my dream that these 2 men went through the gate, and after their certificates had been taken to the king, they entered and were transfigured. The clothing put upon them shone like gold, and they were given harps and crowns. And Ignorance crossed the river with only half the difficulty of the 2 pilgrims, for he was helped by a ferryman named Vain Hope. He ascended the hill and came to the gate alone, but no one met him in welcome. He knocked at the gate, but when asked for a certificate, had none to offer. The king commanded the two shining ones to bind ignorance hand and foot and take him away, and he was put in a door at the side of the hill. Then I saw that there was a way to hell even from the gates of heaven, as well as from the city of destruction. So I awoke, and behold, it was a dream. John Bunyan then tells his readers that he may later tell them of the many things he has been silent about in the story. He bids them adieu, and the Pilgrim's Progress is concluded. The key to the message of Bunyan's unusual book rests in the way he has developed his characters. None of them is really wholly good or wholly bad. Instead, each is evil or virtuous to a degree. And evil, as seen in the Pilgrim's Progress, is more a pettiness, selfishness, or meanness, rather than a demonic power or a reason for being. The villains in the story are even quite capable of being friendly and conversational. And the heroes, such as Christian and Hopeful, have their own weaknesses and failings. They are by no means saints. They are heroes without any of the superhuman qualities that heroes of most legends, myths, or allegories have. Christian even comments at one point, "When I would be doing that which is best, that which is worst is with me." And he adds that those golden hours of pure devotion, as he calls them, are something he seldom experiences. Christian is simply a normal man with no particularly divine or supernatural experiences and no rare attributes. Even towards the end of his journey, he nearly drowns in the river of death. He accomplishes his quest only because he has help, and he accomplishes it against tremendous odds. Neither the heroes nor villains in this story look particularly different from ordinary people we see and meet every day. In fact, they're no different from we ourselves. What Bunyan did by creating pilgrims who are like us is to imply that we, like them, might have glory. All we need to do is try. Any man or woman with grace may become a spiritual, or in this case, Christian, hero. This point of view was the natural one for a Puritan preacher, for the Puritans, as you know now, were focused on bringing spirituality to the common man and integrating it into daily practical life. Bunyan took that principle and, with his own creative genius and inspiration, made it into an allegory that is entertaining and understandable. The pilgrim in his book is ultimately any one of us, and our progress is decided only by our own faith and endurance.
This is the end of the session.